Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, if you read your average metropolitan columnist at the moment, you will find that the skies are bluer, they're certainly clearer, the air is fresher, and the fish are back in the canals of Venice. And for all we know, the grass is greener too. But there is a serious issue here which we're going to discuss today, and that is how far will this crisis affect the green movement? Will it give it a new incentive? Will it mean that the future is indeed greener for everybody? Should it be greener? Or indeed will it be entirely different, particularly given China's position on these particular issues? So today, to talk about that, I have three guests. First of all, Dr. Benny Peiser of the Global Warming Policy Forum, James Delingpole, who's host of the Delingpole podcast and also, of course, columnist and commentator, and Richard Bingley, who is Chief Executive of the Global Cyber Academy. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. I want to start with you, actually, James, if I may. Are we going to see more or less of Greta Thunberg, do you think, in the future?
It's an interesting question. Let me answer it in a different way. I think there are two possible outcomes of this coronavirus crisis. One is, and this is the upside, this is what I'm hoping and praying for, is that it will be increasingly apparent that governments do not have any spare cash to spend on green boondoggles.
Right.
The only reason, this is something that Warren Buffett made years ago. It's known to anyone with a functioning brain. The only reason that the renewables industry, for example, can survive is through state subsidy, through government intervention. Unless people are compelled to use renewable energy, which of course is the darling of the green movement, then people will not pay for green energy. Okay, So clearly, now that the government's coffers have been supposedly exhausted by spending for this crisis, you think about all the money that Rishi Sunak has allocated to enable people to sit in their gardens, improving their suntans. There's not going to be really much left for this net zero project. We need recovery, and the way to economic recovery is not to dump more taxes and regulations and expensive energy on the economy. So that's the happy answer. The unhappy answer is you in a way answered it yourself with your introduction, which is that lots of people are looking outside their windows and thinking, hey, the birds seem to be chirping more cheerily. This is how our post-COVID-19 world will look. It's a greener world, and we need to do more. We need to double down. And you see this happening already, actually, to a degree. You see, for example, that Grant Shapps, while there are no MPs in the Commons to oppose him, he's coming up with all these measures, like all these extra cycle lanes and stuff. You see it's been happening in Italy as well, that Milan, I think, has taken it upon itself to get rid of all these roads and turn them into bicycle routes. This is dangerous, and this I think is slightly the more likely outcome, I fear.
Would you agree with that, Benny? Do you think that is the likely outcome?
By and large, yes. There's, of course, the issue of people avoiding public transport altogether and going back to work in cars. So what you've seen, for instance, in China is a 50% increase in car traffic in the big cities, simply because people are afraid of using public transport. They're not going on their bikes, I can tell you that. That age of cycling in China, when they were dead poor, is over, and they're not going back to bicycles. They want cars, modern cars, the bigger the better. That's what's going to happen in most countries outside of Europe. The Europeans will go down the green route because that is the dominant ideology today. Some things will crash, like renewable energy. Some things will work. A lot of things will become greener simply because A, people want to live in a cleaner world, and B, because very often cleaner means also more efficient, and very often can be done in an economic way that doesn't harm people or the economy. But I don't see any significant change in the short term on the green agenda and the green ideology that most parties in Europe have adopted.
Richard, one thing that's become clear when I was looking, before we did this discussion, and I was looking at what green activists are saying, and some of them are saying things like, I think it's from Extinction Rebellion, for example. One of the co-founders was saying that this has shown how, overnight virtually we can change. So we should take great hope from that. I mean, what do you make of that sort of comment?
Well, I work in and around technology and more private business than I do government. But I feel that, the mere fact it took us an hour to set this interview up, behind the scenes, we were sort of testing microphones and the sound wasn't right. We're just not, as a society, geared up to live remotely and virtually as yet. It might be different in about 50 years' time. So I just think we will pretty much, if the government let us, settle back down to normal. I tend to agree with the first, with James and Benny. Look, it's not just about government. The entire thrust of the global economy in many, many places has shifted towards green. Whether it's a fake science or not is a different issue. That's where most CSR budgets are being spent by the international banks, the big insurance houses. It's where particularly younger people's politics sit at. So I do feel that when we sort of move towards shifting out of COVID and then looking maybe at the American election, if that's not put back, I don't think it will be, but that Joe Biden will raise this as a huge topic. It's a huge dog whistle topic over in America. I think Macron the same when he comes up for re-election. So it will remain a centerpiece political topic. I have to say, in terms of the Green Party and Greta Thunberg, I think post-COVID that they pretty much insignificant in terms of if they ever stood for election or tried to do anything significant in politics. I think the power rests with the big tech firms. The power rests in Downing Street, Washington. How do they want to deal with this? How do they want to deal with China's approach to climate?
The thing is, though, is that one of the things with the Green movement is that they do rely, don't they, on big protests and being very, very visible. And that's kind of been sort of taken away from them. It's been taken away from everybody, but wouldn't you say? I mean, won't this sort of... I mean, you mentioned there it's a dog whistle topic. Is it, though? I mean, has environmentalism really broken through? I mean, it's one of the things people sort of feel, isn't it, that they sort of feel they should be support. But actually, is it really a concern, James?
I think it's a case of the battle between stated preferences versus revealed preferences. Mm-hmm. So if people are asked to do more green action, they'll say, yes, of course we want the planet to be greener, and yeah, we need more money to be spent on green things. But when it comes down to it, as Benny said, they want to travel in their own cars. Yeah. And this is what we're seeing every time. They don't want a wind turbine despoiling their favorite view and chopping up the birds and bats on the horizon. They don't like this stuff. If given a real choice where nobody's watching them, people will not take the green option. I thought I don't normally take issue with Benny, but I thought Benny was conceding way too much territory to the green movement there by saying that greenery is going to, there are ways of helping the economy, rather the ways of introducing green things without damaging the economy. I think that's a fairly narrow definition of green. I mean, in that sense, I'm a green because I like, we all want clean air, we all want clean rivers and stuff like that. But really, let's be honest, green as it exists in the world today is not about those little things. It's not about having clean air and clean rivers. It's about something much more all-encompassing than that. It is about the total transformation of the global economy. And that, I think, is something very scary. And I think there's going to be this battle between Chinese-style oppressive government intervention to enforce this kind of stuff versus individual choice.
No, I think James is right. You know, it's not so much about the actual policies. It's about the size of government these days. Now, I mean, I spend a lot of time driving over through Germany, through Central Europe, and the countryside the landscape is just plastered with turbines, you know, and I don't for a minute believe that those communities have been consulted. I just feel that this is a big sweeping central government initiative, and in an odd way, you know, we're living in a revolving door of crises. You know, it was the green stuff before COVID came along. COVID will probably dissipate next year, then it will kick back into being green or something else. But all along with these things, they are simply not controlled by the grassroots anymore. You know, the COVID response has not been grassroots driven. It's been entirely top down and one dimensional, and so that's why I think this. I'm not disputing the Greens' science. I'm not disputing that the climate change is more rapidly happening. I'm not a skeptic in that way, but I am a skeptic about governmental powers and the ability of governments to do something about it. And I do think it's incumbent on all of us, whether we run companies or whether we're citizens, to be more ecological. This is simply not a top-down thing, but it's becoming an out-of-control top-down vehicle. That you know, coming out of the European Union, coming out of the oil and gas companies, that the rest of us can do nothing about.
Well, I think that it all depends on two issues at the end of the day. One is how severe the economic crisis will be once, you know, the pandemic is over, and whether there will be a rapid recovery or whether we will continue to stagnate and fall behind, because that's what has been happening in the last few decades. The rest of the world is, of course, catching up. They have much higher economic growth rates than most of the Western world. And that's a trend that could easily continue or even accelerate. So the question is, how severe is the economic crisis? And the deeper the crisis and the longer it endures, the less the Greens, which is after all a luxury movement, will really have the return to their kind of dominance. The other big issue is because we know that most of the developing world prioritize economic growth over these environmental, and particularly the climate issue. If they simply continue business as usual while Europe unilaterally decarbonizes, then the economic discrepancy will even be worse. So these are the kind of two issues where I think the jury is still out, how this is going to pan out. But there's a growing realization that unilateral policies that burden your own economies more than anyone else will in the end damage your competitiveness, damage your economy, damage the living standards of people. And that will decide whether or not the Greens have a big revival or whether they will struggle against people who will prioritize recovery and economic growth.
Bernie, do you feel that the world does act in a rational way now, though? I mean, for me, it doesn't really. The fact is we have a whether we agree or not, we have a multinational global green industry. That's not green in many ways. The whole climate change and green agenda has become a sort of a transmogrified global industry. So
not outside of the Western world. No one cares outside of Europe.
Yeah, but the Western world equates to most GDP on the planet and most decision making that has gravitas on the planet. But so if for example, it's simply not true that climate change has been occurring, and this is a fake industry, do you really think that people will move away from that? I think we live now in the world of hyperbole and super crisis. I'm not sure we can adjust quick enough. That's my concern.
No, first of all, this is not about the science of climate change, and you know that isn't really the issue. The issue is whether the international community is actually doing something about CO2 emissions. And the reality is that while in most Western countries emissions have basically stabilized over the last 10, 20 years, most emissions now come from the developing world. And they don't really care about this issue. So there is not this kind of international agreement that we all have to do something about CO2 emissions. The reality is CO2 emissions are rising mainly because most of the world outside the Western world is prioritizing economic growth. They don't care about coal or gas or oil. They want just to develop as fast as they can, raise as many people out of poverty as they can. And that is at the core of the problem. If we had a level playing field, we wouldn't have this international disagreement about, you know, Paris and targets and so on. So I think we have to realize that a lot of the green focus is really a Western luxury that most of the world's public and most of the world's governments, for them, it's not even secondary. This is on their list of priorities very low. Their main priority is development, growth, jobs, industries, you know, civil unrest and so on. And unless this changes, eventually people will say it doesn't make sense to do it unilaterally. Because if you really want to stabilize CO2 emissions, it has to be done globally. And unless there is that global commitment and in real terms, that is not going to help by just Europe or other Western countries going it alone. That is at the core of the problem. And you say, well, the West is dominating the world, and what the West does is kind of dominating the international agenda. This is going to change after this crisis, because I guess that the rest of the world, particularly in Asia, will catch up very fast, and they will become more powerful, not just economically, but also politically and geopolitically and militarily. And Europe is shackling itself by policies that are making industries less competitive, making energy more costly, making life more difficult for families. I mean, if green energy were, you know, as cheap as people claim, we wouldn't have a problem.
Isn't this the point, James, really, just to come in on that? You know, you have this sort of situation that we've just described, but it seems to me that, particularly given the nature of this particular crisis, i.e. coming from China, that actually it could be, you know, even bigger, that essentially the deprioritizing of the green agenda could be even more acute, because we're going to have to somehow compete with this big new power, aren't we? I mean, that's the point. It's far, far more than maybe it would have been maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, definitely the rise of not just China but the East generally is going to become an increasing issue. I mean, you look for example at how the Eastern economies, North Korea, Japan, Singapore, have generally handled this crisis in a way that enables their economies to get back going earlier. So they've already got that head start. I think we're living through a phony war at the moment. I think that it is. I think there is a whole heap of pain coming our way, and I think that greenery is a form of virtue signaling, and it's the habit of a decadent culture, which is feeling guilty about having too much affluence, and therefore feels a kind of compulsion to hobble itself with these green measures as a form of of ritual piety in the same way you might put on a hair shirt, or you might go on a pilgrimage to wherever, to Mecca even. It's a way of compensating for your affluence and your comfortable lifestyle. This is going to change as the economy starts to collapse. Second thing is, we're already seeing cracks appearing in the dam. I'm indebted to Benny's daily newsletter for this. Lufthansa, I think, is being bailed out by the German government. German government is taking a 20% stake in Lufthansa. Now, what's interesting about this is not that they're taking the stake, but that the German government has not imposed any kind of green strictures on Lufthansa. It hasn't said you've got to cut your carbon emissions by blah, 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 which is what some of the other national governments are saying to their airlines. They're trying to impose these green rules. Well, if Lufthansa is not subject to these rules, what incentive is there going to be for the other airlines to obey these rules? There's going to be a real mismatch, isn't there? An economic mismatch. And I'm hoping ultimately that money talks, bullshit walks. That's going to be, I really hope and pray this is what's going to happen, that despite all this urge for green virtue signaling, money will talk louder.
Thing is, James, you talked about it being a kind of virtue signaling thing. Benny called it a luxury, but it's a pretty embedded one now. This is the point, it seems to me, that, okay, you've got the Green Party, but in the West, in this country, their agenda has, largely been embedded in the main parties. This is the point. And I think the other point as well, really, is that on one level it's virtue signaling, but, you wrote a book, James, called Watermelons, which was basically about, being red on the inside. This is how I've always seen this movement, which is essentially that they are socialistic, that they're using this, surely, as a sort of a way in, a Trojan horse, really.
Yeah, no, that's a given. It's very analogous to COVID-19, or whatever you want to call it, that the public has been effectively brainwashed by the government's nudge department into thinking that coronavirus is much, much deadlier than it is. In fact, I think increasingly it's going to become evident that it's no worse than bad seasonal flu, that we massively overreacted. And yet, if you went out into the people's living rooms now and asked them this, they'd say, "Oh no, we need to be very cautious." It's the same with the green movement, which, by the way, is with climate change. Which, like COVID-19, is a scare generated by propaganda and computer models. And ultimately, there is going to be a wake-up moment. There's going to be a wake-up moment with COVID-19. There's going to be a wake-up moment with this greenery, because there was no evidence to support all these measures that are being taken by governments to deal with this. And it was masked in times of prosperity. People had other things to worry about. Now that money is going to be, and the economy is increasingly going to be the focus of people's lives, I think it's going to be much, much harder for green propagandists to do their dirty.
Do you think, what will the wake-up moment be? When will that be, Richard, do you think? We're talking about a coming economic crisis. It almost seems too small a word, actually, for what I'm worried about. What is your view of what it will be like?
I can't really see that there'll be a trigger point, because the whole of sort of the carbon reduction argument was around the world heating up by 3 degrees, over the next 50 years, and that this would create sort of large amounts of drought areas, and particularly Australia or Latin American countries worried about El Nino were adjusting their economies anyway. I was on a call to people in Iraq last week, and they are massively moving away from an oil economy post sort of COVID, and thinking and talking about the type of things that Benny is. I don't think there'll be a trigger moment like there is with COVID, or like some apocalyptic thing like 9/11, international terrorism. I think we've whatever your view is on green, we've kind of buried it and put it in the long grass. And that things like COVID, things like terrorism will usurp it as an issue for the mainstream. And then probably, you get to sort of 30 or 40 years' time where the world may be livable, it may not be. For example, some countries, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, have adjusted for many years to living in barren, sandy landscapes. They've sort of drilled for oil. They're some of the world's most major exporters. I'm not really feeling that we should worry too much about climate change in itself. I'm worried about the political approaches and the economic approaches. But I cannot, in any way, shape or form, foresee a trigger point on this debate, which means it will never get the mainstream political leverage that something like COVID does.
No, I agree. It is very unlikely that there will be some kind of crash or trigger point where people begin to, reassess or correct their views. Not least politicians will never do that. However, there will be certain aspects, certain segments of the agenda, and in my view, the most likely point where the public and also policymakers may reconsider is the cost of the energy and electricity system to the economy. So just to give you an example, if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, there are obviously different approaches and different technologies. And there's a big debate about the cost of renewables and the inefficiency and the instability it creates compared to, let's say, nuclear energy or nuclear together with natural gas. And these will be debates that will, I think, increasingly become relevant. It's not so much that you question the whole green agenda as such, but the debate will hopefully shift to what makes economic sense. Because up until now, the economic question has never really been fully addressed. It's all about, as James said, the alarm. We have to do something. It doesn't matter how much it costs. We have to save the planet. We only have 10 years, so we have to throw the sink at this. And as time progresses, we are beginning to realize some of the things that have been introduced are counterproductive, are damaging, have all sorts of unintended consequences, whether it's wind farms, whether it's biomass, burning whole forests and then shipping them to Britain to burn in power plants, the impact on the environment of these renewable projects. So there are certain segments that will become increasingly contentious, but the main focus in coming years will perhaps shift back to a real assessment of how much does it cost, does it make sense, and what are the kind of options we have if we want to, clean up the environment, because everyone wants to have a clean environment, but it has to make sense, and it has to make practical sense, and it has to make economic sense. That debate has been stifled by the activists and the alarmists, and I think that's the debate that we need urgently in coming years.
I think people were actually very impatient, weren't they, with Extinction Rebellion? I mean, when they had the protests quite recently, on the bridges in London and everything, the patience wore thin, although I have to say it was actually, people were remarkably tolerant, actually, despite that. I mean, that sort of is, James, quite a sort of optimistic outlook that Benny said there, that basically, the pendulum will swift, that we'll have to basically be much more real worldish about this. Do you think that's going to happen? Would you think that is actually how we're going to end up? That we're actually going to say we do not have the time for this anymore?
I do. I mean, okay, as I said, I'm feeling that is the optimistic case, but I've always believed that at the bottom of this is the question of follow the money. The reason that we've got wind turbines disfiguring the countryside all over Europe is because ultimately landowners are given massive subsidies to put these monstrosities on their land. Now, where do those subsidies come from? They don't come from a magic money tree. They ultimately come out of the pockets of energy users. And that wouldn't have been an issue necessarily before COVID-19, but I think it's going to concentrate people's minds. And maybe that there is an upside to COVID-19. Maybe that it will be the kick in the arse that the world needs to realize that it's been sold a pup by vested interests for this last 30 years or so, and that actually you can care after the planet without wanting to ruin the countryside with wind turbines.
I mean, it's good sentiment. The problem we have is obviously you can't not pay your electricity bill. You know, you can't vote with your feet on your utility bill. It's a bit like the BBC license fee. You know, a lot of people now wanting the BBC not to charge a license fee and be privatised. But there's simply no political lever to make that happen, and this is the problem here. I think you know, we might be over amplifying the role of COVID here. I actually, as a Londoner and somebody that commutes and saw this protest quite close up, when was it, back in October, November time, I was stunned by how incompetent the spokespeople were in the media. I think they did a lot of there were a lot of own goals. You know, there was a lot of sort of damage they did to themselves prior to the COVID outbreak. So I think, you know, with any mass political movement, probably they'll recruit more telegenic people, more competent people in the media, and they will come back thriving in 5 or 10 years' time. But for me, I mean, with the Joe Biden and the Donald Trump election, you know, it's a clear dividing line between the two. One is a climate skeptic, the other one is going to use this as a big issue to draw big attention and big amounts of votes from it.
I think it's I mean, Trump has been absolutely sort of, you know, frank and trenchant. He's absolutely, I support the US oil and gas industry, our great US oil and gas industry. There's no sort of ambiguity about that. You know, we are terribly ambiguous, aren't we? I mean, if you look at those briefings that we've had for the COVID thing over the past 2 months, I mean, it was one which was all about, you know, cycle lanes, wasn't it? Grant Shapps got up, the Minister for Transport, huge incentive in cycle lanes in cities. James, you mentioned about Milan. I think Paris has gone the same way, and certainly in London too. You know, is this not going to ruin the whole idea of the great achievements of great cities? I mean, that they're reduced to basically cyclists and pedestrians, don't you think? This is going backwards, isn't it? Totally going backwards. It's
quite dangerous. I mean, I live over in East London, around some quite pleasant fields, you know, sort of London fields, that area. And it used to be quite dangerous before, but now you sort of try and walk the dogs by a canal path or something, you end up almost losing your legs, or the dogs do. And it's actually not very pleasant. You know, there's too much cycling going on, so I think that needs addressing. Can
I just sort of finish by asking you? Yeah, sorry, James. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to sort of counter my early optimism by saying that one of the other less pleasant side effects of this crisis is it's demonstrated how easily governments can just completely act according to their own whims. They've been able to take our freedoms without pretty much so much as a by your leave. They've just gone and, you know, we've almost become, we grew up thinking we were a free country, and we've become pretty much communist China in the space of 2 months. And there haven't been riots. So, you know, I went to a demo in Hyde Park a couple of weeks ago. There were 300 of us there protesting against the biggest assault on civil liberties since in over 300 years. You know, 300 people came out to protest against that. So that argues against my earlier optimism that maybe governments can just railroad through these green policies. Maybe net zero will go ahead. And there's no opposition. I mean, Labour aren't opposing the Conservatives on this. The Lib Dems aren't opposing this. The Green Party aren't. Where is the opposition to this lunacy?
Can I actually, on this general point, I mean, I just want to ask you all really whether you've been surprised, green or not, you know, forget the green issue if you like, but have you been surprised by the British responses? I don't mean the government's response, because I think you've just said that, James, but the British response. my feeling was always that the British had a kind of pugnacious attitude, a bit surly. They weren't going to kind of, they were kind of, they loved their liberties, and you've only got to look at, Pepys and people like that to see that the English, went to places they shouldn't go because they were told they shouldn't go there. That doesn't appear to me to be what's happened this time. I mean, what is your view? Are you surprised, or do you think it's been a very British response?
No, it's not a British response. It's a response all over the world where governments in cahoots with scientists have scared the living daylight out of people. And in a climate of fear and hysteria, anything is possible. People will react animalistic almost. They will basically do the most cruel things you can imagine in periods of mass hysteria. That's the history of humankind.
That's what you think it is, Benny, is it? You think this is mass hysteria?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, you see it 24/7 on the news. People are scared to death. And if you are scared to death, you will do anything the government will ask you to do. You will not go to a demonstration or do anything. And if you dare go out, your neighbor will tell the police and will say, this guy needs to be imprisoned because he met his daughter for the second time.
Apparently, something like 200,000 notices have been put out. People have, actually reported to the police 200,000 times, on their neighbours.
But I just want to say, this has nothing to do with Britishness. Yeah. This mentality you find all over the world. There's no country, apart from the ones where you don't have the lockdown, kind of draconian lockdown, where people have responded differently. Most people have completely adhered to the advice and the rules and the regulations, and that unfortunately is the world we live in today, which makes it much easier for governments to scare people into political direction. And I mean, we have the whole debate about censorship, which I think will get much worse, all in the name of, you can't say this, it's false, it's misleading. And so it's dangerous to say things nowadays because it's all about, saving the planet or saving lives. And in that climate of mass hysteria and panic and anxiety, this is how human beings react. There is no way out. And the only way out is to give people a more realistic picture of the risk we face. And I agree that there is obviously a risk of this virus, but it has been completely exaggerated, and we now realize that the overall death toll from this pandemic will be much, much lower than most models predicted. Much lower. I mean, significantly lower. I think we have 350,000 people so far recorded as having been killed by the Covid-19 virus. The World Health Organization estimates that on average, every year, 250 to 500,000 people die from influenza. So it's not the kind of Spanish flu type of pandemic. And it is a very, severe virus, but far below all the kind of doomsday predictions we heard initially.
You were nodding away a bit to that, James.
I who would have thought, even 6 months ago, that our role model, that the model of kind of ballsiness and freedom and liberty, would be Sweden. I'd always thought of Sweden as the most cucked nation on the European continent. I would have thought the Swedes had nothing to teach us about anything, that they were just kind of socialistic economy where big government ruled and so on. But look at those plucky Swedes. The Viking spirit is alive, whereas the Blitz spirit is dead. It's as if we might as well not bothered fighting the Germans because we ended up getting the Stasi anyway.
Stasi?
Well, I will avoid that one. I'll do but I'm pretty much where Benny and James are. I think it's been massively inflated, this response. You know, I've written stuff from the start. We're not at the figures of 2009. You know, the swine flu then, which took about sort of 500,000 people. I think 500,000 people. You know, it's a mildly severe flu pandemic, it seems to me. But ultimately, I think we need to have an investigation over here in the United Kingdom. We need to understand why, for example, the head of state was pulled out on weekend television to run a metaphor to the Second World War on this. It simply wasn't in any way similar to the Second World War, nor did it look that way, you know, 6 or 8 weeks ago. I think we've been sold a pup. I've written that. And you know, it's sad. It's sad to see this response, because for me, it's a social media mass crisis response. You know, this is probably the first ever example we've got of a social media crisis response. And it, you know, if Margaret Thatcher, if Ronald Reagan, if Tony Benn, if Roy Jenkins were looking at this today, they would be recoiling in disgust about how weak and how lacking in resilience the British Parliament and the MPs have been. And I think that lack of leadership has permeated down. And I completely agree with Benny. I think that ultimately we have, you know, we've completely misread how this is. It's completely out of context. And that what I'm worried about is what comes next. Because if we behave like this on a mildly severe flu pandemic, how are we going to be behaving after, say, the American election or something else that might come down the road?
Yeah, it is a worry. But look, gentlemen, thanks very, very much for coming on today. This is a subject we're going to be discussing. Perhaps you would come back, you know, in 6 months' time, when we can see whether it's the same or more of the same or worse. But thank you in the meantime very much. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, James. Thank you, Richard, very much. Yeah, and that's it for Counterculture this week, and we shall see you next time. Thank you very much.